Hi guys, it's Paul from Emantech, and today we're talking shock buffs. At Emantech we don't believe that one size fits all, and we make a different style shock buff for each pistol. For example, the SP01 has a different style frame and slide, and we've made a shock buff specifically to suit it and fit it exactly with the ridge on it. Same for the CZ75 TS. It's got a special little shock buff with a little foot on it. And the Glock Gen 3, we've made a shock buff specifically to fit into the slide. So I'll show you how all those fit into the different firearms. And there's two main benefits for using a shock buff. Namely, the first one is to protect the firearm and stop metal to metal contact when the slide comes back and hits the frame, and also to absorb felt recoil. Makes the gun feel a little bit better to shoot. Now, our shock buffs are quite firm compared to some others, and you don't generally get that feeling of the slide bumping and bouncing off the shock buff. It's absorbing the recoil quite nicely, so you don't get that double bump that you can sometimes feel with a softer shock buff. So to start, we're going to show you on the Stock 2. This is a Tanfoglio Stock 2, and it's pretty much a flat shock buff, what we normally know as a standard flat shock buff. Just remove your slide from your firearm, remove the guide rod and spring, take the spring off the guide rod, and install your shock buff. Once it's on the guide rod, replace your spring and put the whole assembly back into your firearm. Now, if you've got the thin shock buffs, you can use two, or you can use the thin one. That's back in. Make sure the flat portion of the shock buff is sitting up against the barrel, and that is installed correctly. Replace the slide onto the frame, line up the two dots, and put your slide stop back in. And that firearm is now fitted with a shock buff. On the CZ SP01, it's a little bit different. It's still installed the same way, but we've changed the shape a little bit of the buff to fit the gun a little bit better than a normal flat one. So if your SP01 doesn't have a steel guide rod, you can purchase these, remove your spring again, and you will notice on the shock buff there's a raised portion which is actually designed to fit that part of the slide perfectly. So when the slide recoils back against the frame, the shock buff is perfectly fitted and suited for this slide, and it does its job a lot better than just a flat one. So you'll install this onto your guide rod with the flat portion of the shock buff facing the rear of the guide rod, just like that. Install your spring and put it all back in the firearm with the flat part down against the barrel. Make sure that locks into position like that, and replace the slide to the frame. Line up your marks, install your slide stop, and your firearm is now fitted with a shock buff. The Shadow 2 has a flat shock buff, which you can install anyway, just making sure the flat section is down against the barrel. Let's install that one quickly. There's probably one in here already because it comes with a shock buff from the factory. There we go, it does have one. Remove the guide rod, the spring, the shock buff, put your new shock buff on, spring back on, reinstall it into the firearm, flat side facing the barrel, line it up, install your slide to the frame, and slide stop back in. There we go. CZ75 TS, a little bit different again on the style and shape of the shock buff. Remove your slide stop, take the slide off, remove your guide rod, remove the spring, the shock buff, and our new shock buff, there it is, has got a little foot right at the bottom. Now that again is to fit the frame, and it's also got a recess in it for the head of the guide rod, which fits perfectly into it like that. So make sure you put it on the right way, install your spring, and replace it all into the firearm with the flat side pointing down, just like that. Put your slide back on your frame and reinstall the slide stop, and you can feel that there's no metal to metal contact at the rear when the slide cycles, and that one's installed. Glock Gen 3, there we go. Okay, this is a captive recoil spring. Just remove your guide rod, and the shock buff is designed to fit nice and tight into the slide, and this is how you're going to install it. The shock buff does not go on your guide rod, it goes into the slide. So the raised section is what fits into the slide, and the hollowed out section is what faces the rear of the firearm. Install it like that and reinstall your guide rod. There we go. And that's how the shock buff from Emantech is installed into the Glock. That fits like a glove in the front of the slide, and it'll do its job really well when the slide reciprocates backwards and contacts the frame. Reinstall your slide onto your frame, and that one's installed. 1911, 2011 style pistols. We've just got a standard flat shock buff for that, similar to the S2 and the Tanfoglio. Simply remove your slide, remove your guide rod, install your flat shock buff, either way doesn't matter, over the guide rod, flat side to match the base of the guide rod, reinstall with that section facing downwards towards the barrel, reinstall your spring, the plug, and reinstall your slide to your frame. Almost. There we go. There we go. And we have installed our buffer into the 1911, 2011. And that's about it. Just wanted to show you a quick demo of the differences in our shock buffs. I hope you've enjoyed the video and it gives you some information. Look forward to seeing you on the range, and thank you for watching. Cheers.